Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. From the earliest days of his administration, Mayor Bloomberg has told us, judge me on the success of the public schools. He constantly repeated this mantra during the mayoral campaign, making it a centerpiece of his reelection. Okay, the mayor's won. How are the mayor, Chancellor Klein, and the Department of Education doing? What have been their successes? What are the problems? And what are the prospects for New York City public schools? Joining us to discuss matters of education and the New York City public schools is a regular and wise guest, Seymour Fliegel, president of the Center for Educational Innovation, Public Education Association. Welcome back, Cy.
It's good to be here, Doug.
It's been 6 months, almost exactly, since you were here the last time. And at that time, we were sitting at this table and there was no teacher's contract. They've been out without a contract for 2 years. You had just written an op-ed piece for the New York Times that got a wide circulation, and we talked about several things, and I have to tell you, they were prescient. Looking at the current contract, they were there. You talked about circular R, transfer and bumping policy, disciplinary and grievance procedures, and the length of the schools. Let's look at this current contract. On October 2nd, Memorandum of Understanding for a new contract gets approved by the voting members, goes into effect early November, a week. Talk about the contract, its elements, who won, who lost.
Okay. Like any good contract, and I think the mayor was right, both sides have to feel they got something good out of it. I thought that both the mayor and Klein were not sore winners in the way they behaved at those press conferences. They easily could have been crowing because I think they won major concessions. We had discussed, and you understand them better than anybody else, the 6R, meaning teachers now will be able to be on yard duty, homeroom, lunch duty, hall duty. That is a major victory for kids, and in my personal view, for teachers also. Because I think at the time we actually discussed, you and I were in the yard many, many times.
Absolutely.
That's where we made our bones. That's where kids want to know, who are you? Are you married? Do you have kids? Where do they go to school? So kids want to know teachers. And for teachers to have been isolated, other than when they're standing in front of a classroom, was a negative thing for teachers. So I think teachers in the final analysis, who are good at this, will recognize that this is right for kids.
Okay, now as we've discussed previously, the teachers weren't the only ones who wanted that. It was the negotiators on the other side that said, why are we paying these professionals all this money when we can bring in lower priced paras to do the same thing? So, well, I mean, in defense of the teachers.
Right, good. Look, I like teachers.
Oh, I know you do.
I do, I like teachers. I think teachers are the center of what goes on along with the principal. But think about it. What is that saying? That is basically saying that a school aide, because we're school aides, can do as good a job as teachers. Now, the truth of the matter, in my opinion, kids respect teachers. Kids want approval from teachers. It's a different story with a school aide who's from the neighborhood, who doesn't have the training and so on. So for teachers to say it's the same thing is to belittle who they are. Mm-hmm. And in the final analysis, you're going to have a much safer environment, a better learning environment with teachers who are respected. Because I do respect teachers. For me to say it doesn't matter, it's the guy who says it doesn't matter that equalizes the two. I mean, teachers have experience, they have college degrees, some have doctorates and so on. They know much more about child development. Mm-hmm. They know. You can't say that a school aide who's getting paid a lot less is the equal to that.
Okay.
So that was, and the other part of that I thought was a fake really, was that the teachers would then engage in tutoring, being head of the newspaper and so on. Very little of that happened. So the logic, I know the argument that was given to Tony Coles and the mayor. Listen, they can do all these wonderful things. I asked the principal, because one of the rules, you did not have to tell the principal where you were when you were doing these things instead of, so I said to a principal, how do you know? He says, if I had to, I would be running around the building all day long, every period, to find out where a teacher is working with a kid. There's no way I was going to do that. So it was another free period, basically.
Okay, now let's move from circular or directly. Let's move to the principal.
Okay.
Does this contract begin to address the problem of the principal, and that is that the principal's got the responsibility, but really hasn't had neither the power nor the resources to do the job that the principal is required to do under this new principal-centered model?
You're absolutely right about that. This is a message to principals. And if they don't see it, I'd be very surprised. Look what it says. It says, you are in control of what happens in your school. So you're the only one who's accountable, by the way. There's no one else really accountable, right? So the message is, let's take the next thing in the contract. Do you know that under the former contract, a UFT teacher could arrive in your school as principal who you never saw or spoke to and present his paper and say, I'm now in your school?
Explain this previous provision and the change.
The change is that no longer can happen. The principal must approve of anyone who wants to transfer into a school. Now, he can have a committee of teachers who interviews the teachers, but in the final analysis, he now has the approval, so he will not get, you know what the story was. Look, when I was there, you have a teacher who's unsatisfactory. By the way, the big improvement they made years ago was you no longer could transfer if you were marked unsatisfactory. So now...
So principals couldn't dump people onto their colleagues. So
now, you know what was happening? I call you and Doug, I'm going to mark you unsatisfactory. However, here's the vacancy list. I think it would be wise for you to transfer. So now we didn't get the guy who was marked unsatisfactory. We got the future unsatisfactory guy. So now
this was part of this transfer policy that was based on seniority, that senior teachers could move in and literally bump a more junior teacher out.
Right. Now,
without the principal.
You know what that does to a school? You have a young teacher who's been there a year, 2 years, who's really good. Suddenly that teacher gets bumped out of that school. That is over with this contract. So that's another thing that says to principals, you are in charge. See, how do you hold somebody accountable if you're not responsible for the personnel you bring into the school?
Absolutely. I agree. So this is a step in that direction.
It is not a step. It says that can't happen anymore.
Okay, so this, I mean, okay.
So that's the same, I'm saying, I'm building the messages.
Okay, go ahead.
With 6R now changed, with you can't just transfer in without the principal's approval. And now the idea that teachers may no longer grieve a letter in your file. Now that may sound like, well, so what? But you know what the grievance meant? It meant the amount of time that principals had to spend justifying a letter. A teacher now still has the right to answer the letter. Say, I think you made a major mistake. I was not the one who stole the cookies. You know, I mean, whatever it is.
Right.
They have that right, and I think that's fine. But to have to go through a grievance procedure anytime you put a letter in a teacher's file is to discourage putting letters in files of teachers who deserve to have something pointed out to them. So those are just three major givebacks that I think you got to give Klein and his law department. This guy Daniel Weisberg, I think, did a very fine job, and the mayor. There was a lot of pressure on the mayor from friends of the mayor and friends of Randy. Why are you bothering with this issue? We've had this all these years. No mayor has ever insisted that we have a change in work rules. So I give Bloomberg and Klein a lot of credit that they held on to it.
Okay, let's talk about, just for a moment, I don't want to focus on it, the politics of the contract. What allowed this to happen politically where it didn't happen before?
Okay, well, you understand this. You're the political scientist here. At one point, it looked like Freddie Ferrer had a shot at winning this election earlier on.
Right.
And at that point, I don't speak for the union, but I think there was a sense of, you know, if we don't have a contract now, maybe we'll do much better. If we got a Democratic mayor in, Freddie Ferrer came in, we would do much better. It became clear very early that Bloomberg was going to win and win big.
Right.
That changed the political perspective of what's going on. Now just picture after the election. See, it was to both sides' advantage to settle it before the election, because Bloomberg didn't want to take the chance of a problem.
And also he didn't want to not reach an agreement and have the UFT endorse his opponent.
That's right. So that's why I'm saying he didn't want to do that. And yet the union felt, well, once he's elected, he's in the power position. He could say, this is what I'm offering you. Now, in fairness, from the union's perspective, if you look at both raises that Bloomberg gave them, I think it comes to 33%.
There's another side of this ledger here.
That's right. That's why it's a good contract.
Right.
You see, it's never a good contract if one side kills the other side. Now, there are some critics, conservative guys, who thought this was the time to wipe out the union. That was unrealistic, and that's not what anybody wanted, to wipe out the union. So you have to say that... Even
though Chancellor Klein sometimes almost seems as if he's not too happy with unions as a phenomenon, but that's okay.
Okay, but I think that Klein, because I like Klein, I've said this many times, he took a lot of personal abuse in this, and he was willing to hug and kiss when it was over.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Now, Randy wasn't, by the way. You know, a week later down in Denver, the Educational Writers Association of America, she blasted both Klein and Bloomberg.
Well, you have to understand, I mean, you certainly understand that in terms of the internal politics as well as the external.
And it was an interesting vote, because I think it's 63% voted for the contract.
Right.
Where normally a union can get 80%.
85, right.
But I think they wanted that message out. It was very interesting.
Well, that's a good message. I put myself in that position where I've been.
You say
you vote no to send the message.
That's right. Listen, I don't want everybody to think I'm overjoyed by this. But I think if you do add up the total of 33% increase, that's going to bring in some different kind of folks into teaching.
It begins to, if not equalize, begins the step toward approaching equalizing what we're doing with the suburban districts and what we're doing here.
And it's true, the mayor and Klein picked up some extra minutes, 10 minutes more.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that too. Well, let's talk about salaries. Let's stay with salaries for a second. The other contracts that were negotiated with the other unions right before the election, the cops and the firemen, each one of those contracts had significant reductions of entering policemen and firemen's pay. That didn't happen with the teachers.
No.
The teachers got a not insubstantial increase for entry-level teachers, I guess recognizing the very importance of entry-level salaries in terms of bringing in those folks.
That is the critical factor. Nobody ever talks about it. But think about it. We're the only profession that talks about professional development all day long. Lawyers don't talk about professional development. Journalists don't keep saying we need more professional development. It's another way of saying we need, and that's why I like the idea of Teach for America, getting better schools, better educated folks to come into teaching.
Also, I've found that people in other professions who come in who weren't originally teachers and then were trained as teachers make better teachers because they have more life experience. They tend to be older and more mature. I like those non-professional teachers.
You're absolutely right. The CUNY Fellows program.
Right. Okay.
Because I had a kid I taught who's retiring as engineer, and he came to see me, and he's a teacher now, and I know he's a damn good teacher.
Yeah.
So. By the way, that's one of the big weaknesses of No Child Left Behind, that every teacher has to be certified. Think about it.
I know.
And I was on another show, and I said, the ones who benefit most from that rule are the schools of education.
Sure.
Because everybody has to come.
Absolutely.
So I'm not saying they don't need training. I think what CUNY is doing is very good. They give them that program. You got people who really want to be teachers. Right. They've got experience. They're bright. So that's a critical thing. So I think the salary, and the extra time, think about it. They had to do that because they keep comparing themselves to the suburban teachers. The suburban teachers work till 4 o'clock. So it's not a big deal.
Well, their
that they
hours
gave
are
up.
longer than ours because I was on the school board in northern New Jersey, and our day was
A longer
50
day.
minutes longer
That's
than
right.
the
So
current
That's-
contract.
So I'm saying they had to get. That was not a big give up.
Is this extra time being used appropriately, if
That
you
is
will,
a
and
critical
wisely?
factor. I think it's now going to be used that way because it is going to be for instructional
So
time.
it's teaching.
It's teaching. Now, I think it's limited to 10 kids, but that's fine. I like situations. The kids will learn. When you sit down with a kid for 5 minutes, it's worth 45 minutes of someone standing there and the kid doesn't know what you're talking
Right.
about. But when you explain something to them. So,
And that gets to that personal contact that you talked
the
about
kids
earlier.
will get to love a teacher.
Right.
When a teacher spends time with you and talks to you, and you see a different side of that teacher. Because teachers want to be good to kids.
Right.
But many times they're in a situation they don't understand, or now they do, that they're the prisoner in front of the class. They think they got the class as the prisoner. They're stuck up there.
Okay, okay.
So I think it's a good opportunity.
Okay, on the other side of the win-win ledger, on the teachers winning, having been a teacher, was the number of what we've called Stalinistic micromanagement, rugs and organization of the classroom, and if you can use the board, and some absolutely mindlessly
Real stupid
rigid
stuff. You and I
rules.
discussed this
a
earlier
long time
on.
ago.
Where the rug should be, the rocker has to be
And some of that
here.
was eliminated.
Actually, it's very funny that it's actually in a contract.
It's crazy.
Right. I mean, you would think no one would need to put it in the contract, but I understand why they put it in the contract, because what you had were these people who knew they had the one way for kids to learn, and they were making, one of the examples was they were actually putting newspapers on the chalkboard so the teachers couldn't use the chalkboards because they didn't want. So that is out, and no
Okay.
teacher can be penalized. Look, you and I have discussed, if you want to be a good teacher or good principal, you need a couple of things. I think you need courage and passion. And what that other stuff was doing was pushing back courage and lowering passion.
I agree.
So I think that was the right thing to do.
Okay, let's move off the contract and let's look at the Department of Education itself as an institution and how it is governed. It's Byzantine, it's bureaucratic, and what needs to be done? What reforms need to happen on the institutional organizational level so that principals can do what they need to do and teachers can do what they need to do and given the resources to do it?
I think it was a fair criticism of the system, of the McKinsey concept.
To
Where
bring in the management experts and
all
they
the
can solve your
management,
problems.
and we had all these very young, bright young people who had no experience in the system. Now I think they have experience in the system. I think they're learning how to run the system.
Except they still haven't been in the classroom, and I think
That's
that
right.
matters.
That's a critical factor. I agree. So I think you once asked me, well, what will happen after the election? Because we both understood.
Well, that's where I'm going right now. What happens
we
now?
both understood that prior to the election, there wasn't a lot of things weren't going to happen. And we can get into discussion of the reading test scores. 'Cause
We will. We will.
That's not a problem. I think what we have a right to see, I think last time I said, first let's look at what happens with the contract. Then you'll know. If
Right.
none of these things happen, I would have said, well, they got nothing. So, okay.
But according to
Now,
what we talked about in your
they
op-ed
did
piece,
well.
they did real well.
They did well, and I did the right thing. Now we have to see what changes are made. You have 10 regional superintendents. By no way are all 10 tops.
Right.
And I'm being kind.
Right. Right.
So we have to watch and see, what does Klein do? Does he make changes? I think he will. And then that will be a sign that he recognizes what kind of changes have to take place.
At least in terms of personnel. What about
That's
the
right.
structure?
You see, you and I had also discussed it. I said it's like they must have read a Roman general's
Right,
book.
tens.
Yeah, tens. They call them tens. Now, the structure doesn't make sense in this regard. And it comes back to the regionals. We now have people who are responsible for 147,000 kids, which is larger than most city systems in the country.
Right.
Right? They're just,
It's huge.
Boston, 69. Newark, 49. Pittsburgh, 38,000. These are major city systems.
Right.
So now we have 10 regions where these people are responsible. Like, you would never say, I think this guy should be the superintendent of Boston. You'd say, what are you, serious? The last thing he did was he was principal of a small school. So I think there has to be some kind of change. Now, either they have to empower the local instructional superintendents, which don't have much power.
Well, that's another group of 5 or 10. I can't quite figure all this
There's
out.
105 of them.
Okay.
Right? So Klein would say to you, and I remember saying, okay, I'm going to believe that. Because I said, you're too centralized. And he says, no, with the 105 lists, we're more decentralized. Each of them have 10. But the question becomes, what authority do they have?
Right.
And how do they feel about principles?
Right.
Because my belief is the change has to take place at the school site.
Right.
The leadership is the critical factor. The teachers are the critical factor. So what has to happen, which I don't think has happened in most cases, those local instructional superintendents, they weren't superintendents before, have to become supportive services, not monitoring services. Of course, that comes from when Central says, look, when you're a regional, you got 147,000 kids, you think you know what's going on? You really don't know it. So you got to give orders. And then they begin to carry out the orders. They have to view themselves as we are facilitators and supporters of the school site. The good ones do that. So that's where the change has to take place.
How do we get good ones? Is there a mechanism by which these people are taught to do what they're supposed to do?
Well, that's a good question. I doubt it. And I like Carmen Farina, by the way. I think was a major, major improvement.
Oh, please, we know this.
That's
We don't
an
want to go there.
understatement. We don't want to go there at all. But I like, and I'm sure that there's training of these local instructional superintendents. But they've got to see that their role is to support the school, make life better for the principal and the teachers. Not to go say, you didn't do this, we got rid of the rug thing.
Right.
You know what really got rid of the rug thing? The union came up with they were brilliant on it. They said, this is no good for asthmatic kids.
Right.
That's why.
I mean, yeah, well, you killed Westway with the striped vest. No matter how you get
That's
it,
what happened.
I get it.
So I think there's got to be changes, and we've got to see what changes take place amongst those local instructional superintendents.
What about the leadership of the principals? Or is the system providing enough resources, instruction, whatever, that they need to be leaders?
Well, you see, the Leadership Academy conceptually makes a lot of sense. I don't know how well it's working, to tell the truth. And
both in terms of numbers of outputs as well as the quality
and the
of the
cost
output.
of it. You know, I think
it's very high, 300,000 per.
That's a lot of money for it. But conceptually, it's the right idea that the system create their leaders and train their leaders.
I know. Well, it came out of the Baruch School of Public Affairs,
That's
so
right.
I'm obviously supportive of the approach.
That's right, of course. Now, I think what has to happen, and I'm not positive of this, but I think we've allowed all the assistant principals to become non-entities. Something's got to be said in favor of experience. In other words, at the Leadership Academy, I have a gal who's now a principal who was a kindergarten teacher for 3 years.
Right.
That was her total experience.
You need some kind of
There's
supervisory
something,
experience.
You need some supervisory experience. And I think we've neglected the APs.
Okay.
So we're going to try, the CEI-PEA wants putting in a proposal with the foundation, the Cummings Foundation. We want to train those APs, but this is the difference, and that's what's the difference about this. Remember, we had a discussion. Up until very recently, it was a self-selection process.
Right.
Kid guy comes home, he's a lousy teacher. He tells his mother, I'm a lousy teacher. He says, well, why don't you become a principal? Go to CUNY or go somewhere, get 18 credits, and you're a principal. That doesn't make sense.
Okay.
What we're saying is, and we have a very strong field operation. John Falco's my senior fellow for field. We want them to recommend people, APs, who they think will make good leaders. Then work with them because they have the experience and there's this recommendation of who they are. And we would train them to become principals. One of the things we did in East Harlem, I realize now because I see all our alternative school directors became very good principals.
Okay.
Because it was small, but they had all the same problems.
Right.
So you got to learn something. You want to look. Would I become a journalist and say, "Hey, I think tomorrow I'll become a journalist. I'll sit over there and I'll start." You need some you need some experience
Right.
at it.
Okay.
That's what we got to do, and I think we're going to try and do that.
What else? I mean, if you were given the authority, you're the chancellor.
Okay.
And the mayor says, "Cy, go to it."
you want us to-
Give me two more.
Okay. One of the things I would have to say to the mayor, the system is too large. We all think we can. It's 1,200,000 kids. Yeah, I can handle it. Budget $13, $14 billion, larger than most countries. Yeah, I handled that when I was in San Diego. I could do this and so. It's a tough job. So we got to get back to the idea of making the school the center of change.
Okay.
And that's why, and you know, Joel often says that it's the leadership is the critical factor in change. Now he's got to do things that convince those principals that they are the critical factors in the change. And he's got to do things for teachers in those schools that they begin to feel you can, you know, we say you got to change it one school at a time. Doesn't mean 1 year you do one school.
Right.
But the emphasis has got to be on schools, and it has to be on outcomes, by the way. And I think, you know, that brings us to the testing. You know, I have my whole rap on testing.
You got 30 seconds.
Okay. I think it's disgraceful when, because of the political, when the kids did well, for these guys to say, you know what it's like? You're a kid, you come home, you say to your mother, you know what? I'm now in level 3. I did well on the test. Your mother says, yeah, it was an easy test. Don't, you know. What do you think the kid feels? That's ridiculous. When the tests were poor results, no one ever said it was too hard. So we have to accept it. And I called the test makers, by the way, and we had our reading people. Those tests are legitimate tests.
So they show us
real improvement.
Okay.
Significant improvement.
And we can look for further improvement, yes or no?
I hope so.
Okay,
Yes.
that's it. Too much, not enough time, too much to talk about.
Always
Thanks
fun.
again.
Thank you.